blue medallion.
Following up a success is a hard thing to do. There is usually a feeling of wanting to stick to what worked the first time around, to basically just run it back. Creatively, there is also a desire to try new things and flex different muscles, show what else you can do. Outlast 2 does a little of both, to varying degrees of success. The game came out 4 years after the first one and was yet another financial success. Outlast 2 is a divisive game among fans of this series for reasons we will get into. It's ambitious, introduces new gameplay mechanics, and overall takes big swings. Some of them work, others not so much. We'll get into all of that and more in this video, so join me for a helicopter ride deep into the Arizona desert to face our past in the disturbing sequel known as The last time I played Outlast 2 was back in 2020. Going into this video and having not played Outlast 2 since then, my memory of the game was that it was the better of the two games. Is that still true? My gut reaction, having just finished the game for this video, is that it's a lot more disturbing and upsetting than I remembered it being. It's a game that's horrifying in a way that's like more deeply affecting than just scary guys chasing you around. In this video, we'll talk about all the differences between Outlast 1 and Outlast 2, as well as the things that Outlast 2 does, whether or not they work or don't work. But before we get into all of that, let's first talk about how Red Barrels went about updating the sequel from the original game. The first big change the team at Red Barrels decided to make was to move things from the tight, claustrophobic halls of Mount Massive to the open spaces of Temple Gate, Arizona. If you recall from my video on Outlast 1, Red Barrels had a budget of 1 million Canadian dollars for the first game, and with that game being such an immense success, the budget for Outlast 2 was upgraded to 7 million Canadian. And I will say, you can tell that Outlast 2 had a lot more money behind it. There are more locations, more voice actors, and the game graphically looks better overall than the original. There's also just a lot more going on in this game in general. Thematically, there's more heavy subject matter on display, and narratively, they have the added task of having to tie into not only the first game, but the comic series The Murkoff Account, that was released the year prior to Outlast 2 releasing. As mentioned, the most jarring shift at first glance from the first to second game is the difference in location. Opting for a more rural setting, Red Barrels moved the horrors from indoors to outdoors. They did this in an effort to challenge themselves to not just do the same thing they did in the first game, drawing on even more horror film influences such as Children of the Corn, The Shining, Jacob's Ladder, The Omen, the works of Clive Barker, and even The Descent, to name a handful. Mechanically, the game has also introduced some new gameplay features that slot neatly into the already established Outlast formula. Things like locking and unlocking doors to hold off pursuers, opening windows, crawling, hiding in barrels, swimming underwater, and using bandages to heal yourself. Another change is that Blake does not have the unlimited stamina that Miles had from the first game.
Got the stamina, you're lacking the stamina. You're lacking the stamina while you...
There is also a continued emphasis on an immersive HUD carried over and expanded from the first game, where you can see your current amount of both bandages and batteries, as well as now being able to review important footage you capture, accompanied by commentary you don't get during the moment-to-moment gameplay. You can also do a cool little power slide to quickly elude enemies, granting the player a more fluid mobility suite for avoiding danger, which can now represent itself in the form of QuickTime events that the player will have to respond to in order to avoid an untimely death. One cool new feature is the addition of the camera microphone, which is a feature that can be toggled on and off, where enemy dialogue and movements can be heard more clearly, allowing the player to detect enemies through walls and across large distances. Given how much larger the environments are this time around, this feature is perfectly at home in Outlast 2. While I think this is a cool idea on paper and appropriate diegetically with the camera's built-in functionality, you can easily go long periods of time without actually ever using this feature. I think it's only really required to proceed 1 or 2 times throughout the entire game's runtime. To that point, though, I will say that Outlast 1 and 2 are both games that are best experienced with lights off and a headset on. So if you're the type who plays games this way and really gets into the experience, this feature will definitely increase the tension and overall immersive atmosphere, but unfortunately it does kind of feel like an afterthought at the end of the day. The sort of gameplay loop found in the first game makes its return here, being run, hide, turn something on, run some more, avoid a pursuer, etc. However, with environments being more wide open this time around, Blake finds himself having to avoid multiple enemies at a time, something that wasn't really present in the first game. While I think the idea to make a drastic shift in location probably sounded good in theory, I will say that the established Outlast formula from the first game doesn't actually work as well this time around, which is unfortunate because I respect Red Barrels for wanting to mix it up, but it turns out that the location they chose is sort of antithetical to the formula they've already established. Despite looking like a large open area, many of the locations of Outlast 2 are actually just hiding the fact that there are only so many ways to go, funneling the player in the intended direction, creating the illusion of space, but in reality they just replaced real walls with invisible ones. Another big change that helps to elevate this next installment in the series is the expanded characters. Blake is not a silent protagonist like Miles Upshur.
Oh, fuck me! Fuck! That did not happen in the crash. Fuck this.
Miles would express himself through written notes in his journal, but would never actually speak. He'd scream and grunt, sure, but not much else. Outlast 2 introduces us to Blake and Lynn Langerman. This time around, Lynn is the investigative journalist, while Blake is Lynn's cameraman. The game sees Blake losing his wife Lynn and having to go through hell and back to find her. If you saw my first video on Outlast 1, then you'll remember that a lot of the criticisms a lot of people had about that game was the lack of characterization on the part of protagonist Miles Upshur. So Red Barrels heard all that feedback and they greatly improved upon it in the sequel with protagonist Blake Langerman. And to a lesser extent you have Lynn, as well as some other characters, so all around the characterization is a lot better in this game. Blake has a personal vested interest in seeing out the events of the game to their final conclusion. Miles is just trying to survive, but Blake is trying to save another person. It may not seem like it at first, but on a subconscious level, this is a significant change from a gameplay perspective. There is a level of immersion and investment on the player's part when you're able to give us a strong yet simple reason to persevere. While it's a pretty common trope in horror games, you know, the protagonist having to find and save their wife. I'm looking at Silent Hill 2, Alan Wake, Dead Space. You know, it's a very common trope, but it's a trope for a reason, and it's because it works. It gives the player a feeling of wanting to proceed and advance the story. And as a character, Blake himself is very well defined. A large portion of the story is literally there to expand upon and flesh out his backstory. And, you know, as a character, the moment-to-moment gameplay, he's kind of quippy, he'll make jokes, he'll, you know, react to what's happening around him. And, you know, sometimes he'll make quips that aren't really appropriate for the situation that he finds himself in.
Jesus. Should have prayed for refrigeration.
I don't know, maybe it's like a coping mechanism for dealing with the craziness that he's finding himself in the middle of. I don't know. At any rate, this all leads to him being a three-dimensional character with a clearly defined motivation, something that makes a big difference when creating memorable characters in a horror game. Before we get into the main breakdown of the story of Outlast 2, I want to acknowledge a few things. First, Outlast 2 is a horror game that paints on a canvas of religious iconography, taking themes of faith and twisting them to compose a disturbing, gut-wrenching narrative. Additionally, there are themes of abuse and trauma that may be triggering for some. If you've played Outlast 2 already and none of this is new to you, carry on, but if you haven't and these are things that may cause you discomfort, I felt the need to provide something of a trigger warning ahead of the story breakdown. So with all that being said, let's make our way into Temple Gate and see what we can uncover. Outlast 2 begins with Blake and Lynn en route to the location of an alleged murder via helicopter. They are here to film a story on the victim, one Jane Doe, who was found to be pregnant at her time of death. We established early on that Blake and Lynn are a married couple who have known each other since childhood. The game begins officially when Blake awakens from a nightmare on the helicopter. Upon waking, Lynn chastises Blake for sleeping, as well as for calling out another woman's name in his sleep. Blake doesn't seem to remember, but then Lynn tells him the name was Jessica. Blake then admits that he was dreaming about Jessica Gray, a girl they both apparently knew from school. The pilot interrupts, confirming with the two journalists that he's looking for some sort of factory out here in the middle of nowhere. According to the autopsy report of Jane Doe, Lynn believes that the victim must have been downstream of pretty heavy industry, but both they and the pilot see nothing of the sort from the aerial view of the chopper. Blake and Lynn decide to record an intro for the news segment they are preparing on the case when the helicopter starts to experience some turbulence. They are temporarily miffed but continue, but moments later a loud droning noise accompanied by a glaring burst of white light causes the helicopter's engine to fail and subsequently begin to plummet out of the sky. The screen then cuts to black and we're treated to a title card for Outlast 2. We then take control of Blake again, however this time we are in the hallways of a Catholic school. This is a flashback sequence to Blake's childhood, one that we will revisit many times throughout the course of the game. The fluorescent lights of the school hallways provide a stark counterpoint to the dark, open areas of the Arizona desert that the majority of the game takes place in. Young Blake walks around a bit before seeing a tall figure walking away from him further down the hall. Blake attempts to follow, but a door slams shut in his face, prompting him to turn around and be faced with a young girl. This is Jessica Gray, the girl we mentioned earlier. A river of blood engulfs her, us, and the entire hallway as we shift back into the reality of the crash aftermath. Blake is hurt but alive, however Lynn is nowhere to be found. This is concerning, but better than us finding her body in the crash, so there is hope for the time being. God knows we will need it. Upon arriving at the crash site, the game prompts us to hold the recording reticule over the subject, in this case, the debris. This is the new mechanic I mentioned earlier where Blake will record things of interest, and we can then review the footage in the camera's menu and hear commentary from Blake himself regarding the things that he witnesses throughout the events of the game. Spurred on by Lynn's absence from the crash site, Blake resolves to find her. A seed of fear is planted almost right away when Blake discovers the pilot, skinned alive and hanging from a nearby tree. Not long after finding the pilot, Blake discovers a seemingly empty town. He wanders around a bit looking for help when he notices that the town isn't as empty as first thought. There are people around, but they disappear into the background whenever Blake notices them, like Homer retreating into that one hedge. We venture further into the town, seeking someone who can help. During this introductory section, we encounter a jump scare when opening a window, repeating the slow, tension-building practices of Outlast 1's early game. Not long after this, we eventually reach what appears to be some sort of unholy chapel. Essentially, what we have here is the residents of Temple Gate, the town we are in, are members of a religious cult led by Sullivan Noth, a charismatic leader who has convinced his followers to sacrifice all of their children in the name of God. In addition to this, he forces himself on the women of this cult and then, once pregnant, condemns the children to death, claiming them to be the Antichrist. We leave this unholy nursery of sorts and progress further, searching for Lynn. Before long, we meet Marta, one of the pursuer enemies of Outlast 2, and the one I remembered being most afraid of whenever I first played this game years ago. She's pretty terrifying, but we won't have to deal with her just yet, thankfully. Following our encounter with Marta, Blake learns to use the camera microphone to detect enemies, like I mentioned earlier. We run into some cultists at this point, and I start hauling ass for about 2 seconds before being promptly flashbanged again by this white, omnipotent light from before. After regaining our bearings, we push ahead and finally reach Noth's chapel, where Lynn is being held by Noth and the members of the cult. Blake navigates the holding cells beneath the chapel until eventually witnessing Lynn leaping from a window to freedom, but seeming to injure herself in the process. Blake jumps down to help her, and the two of them begin running to safety. Blake notices that Lynn appears to be suffering from stomach cramps. Blake demands to know what happened to her in the short time she was captured, but she says she can't talk about it. Fearing the worst, they venture onward until eventually being surrounded by cultists. A struggle ensues, but then suddenly a third party joins the fray. These are the heretics, citizens of Temple Gate who used to belong to Noth's cult, but have since splintered off into their own faction with their own beliefs, led by Val, another of Outlast 2's pursuer enemies. Val and the heretics are actively trying to spur on the birth of the Antichrist, rather than Noth's cultists, who are going to fanatical lengths to prevent it. The heretics arrive, murder all the cultists, and take Lynn, who refer to her as the Mother. Blake continues on in search of his wife, swimming underwater through a riverside settlement until once again getting flashbanged so hard that he teleports back to that creepy Catholic church. As we experience more and more of these flashbacks, we begin to realize that they seem to be telling a story out of order, like a series of images chopped up and moved around on the timeline. It's revealed to us that Blake, Lynn, and Jessica all knew each other in school. Traversing the empty, dark halls of the school at night feels akin to the halls of Mount Massive in terms of atmosphere. Yet somehow the clean, sterile look of the school is even creepier than the blood-stained look of the asylum. Blake encounters the man from before, who charges at us before disappearing into shadow. We then head outside into the snow before falling down and transitioning seamlessly once again back into reality. These transitions back and forth between Blake's unresolved childhood trauma and the events of the present in Temple Gate are a really unique storytelling device, with the actual gameplay transitions themselves being really seamless and often happening when you least expect them to. After snapping back to reality, Blake is met by Ethan, the father of the girl he and Lynn are here to investigate. Ethan is a defector of Noth's cult. Noth got involved with Ethan's daughter, and then ordered Ethan to commit infanticide. Unwilling to do so, Ethan instead attempted to help his daughter escape the cult. He technically succeeded, despite the fact that Jane Doe, real name Anna Lee, would inevitably meet her demise later down the road, as detailed in the comic series The Murkoff Account. And obviously, by the time the events of Outlast 2 are transpiring, we know that she unfortunately is no longer alive. Blake, realizing that Ethan's daughter is the girl in question, is unable to tell the poor man that his daughter is dead. Instead, he lies and tells him that she's okay. Incredibly grateful, Ethan hides Blake under the floorboards so that he can rest. Blake has more nightmares about Jessica, and later awakens to Marta interrogating Ethan as to Blake's whereabouts. Ethan, being the absolute real one that he is, does not give up Blake's location to her. It would seem that, fulfilled by the false knowledge that Anna Lee safely made it out of the cult, he is tragically content to defy the cult, even if it means his own undoing. Marta leaves and Blake departs soon after, grateful for Ethan and his willingness to provide sanctuary to a stranger.
You didn't give me up to her. Not even though she... Thank you.
Something I like a lot about Outlast 2 is this moment here in the game where you can tell that Red Barrels was really making a concerted effort to inject more humanity into the proceedings amidst all of the darkness and morbidity. You can tell that this time around they really wanted to craft a more human story built around ideas like faith, guilt, and trauma. I would say that they succeeded in this area. Blake continues in his quest for Lynn and crosses paths with Marta again. We elude some cultists in a cornfield, traverse a barn, and eventually get dropped into a pile of bodies. In no time at all, we enter a sort of heretic temple with an effigy to a dark deity, possibly meant to represent the Antichrist. This part was giving me major Wicker Man vibes. Because of the frequent white flashes of light, we begin to hallucinate visions of Jessica hanging in the real world, Catholic school not included. We go on to encounter an elevator and another small settlement, and here the classic Outlast gameplay loop kicks in. We must turn the power on to this elevator, located somewhere in this town. Blake must stealthily evade the cultists who are actively looking for him in order to accomplish this. I will say this sort of thing used to be a lot more present in the original game and only crops up a handful of times in Outlast 2. Your mileage will vary as far as whether or not this is a good or bad thing. Anyway, I entered a house and find a battery for my camera, as well as a man who appears to be sleeping. Sensing no danger, I decide to catch my breath in here for a minute when the guy decides to wake up and start kicking my ass, alerting the other cultists to my presence.
At a time like this. Oh, wait, you're awake. Are you good? Oh, oh! Oh, shit! What the fuck?
Clearly, my ocular pat-down skills need a bit of work where these townsfolk are concerned. At this point, I decide to abandon any pretense of stealth and just haul ass to the elevator's power source. For the record, I played Outlast 2 on story mode this time around. I'm really more just here to take in the atmosphere, the fresh air, and the narrative. We're not doing any crazy achievement runs or anything like that. I'll leave that kind of stuff to the sadists out there who like playing on nightmare difficulty and stuff like that. After a couple of botched attempts, we finally manage to cross up Marta and reach the elevator. Upon exiting, we venture forward to hear a voice that appears to be coming from the bottom of a well. We look down and a freaky-looking tongue drags us down to the bottom, prompting another transition to the Catholic school from hell. So these sections, while interesting narratively and visually provide a nice contrast, usually consist of a lot of aimless running around. We typically will need to trigger a cutscene by interacting with a relevant object, in this case a music box found in Jessica's locker. Maybe I'm dumb, but there were a few times in these sections of the game where it took me a lot longer than it should have to figure out what to do, as it's usually pretty obtuse and never conveyed to the player in any meaningful way. In these flashbacks, a recurring visual I want to talk about is this snowy courtyard. This place is so visually striking to me. There is something so discomforting about it. The eerie silence of the snow falling in this brightly lit courtyard. In any other scenario, it would be considered peaceful. However, here, at night, in this school, in a place that we should not be, there is a feeling of something off. Anyway, we continue down the halls to see Jessica hanging again. This time her body is pulled into the ceiling by the tongue monster. We then go to open a door in the school and are returned to Temple Gate, and are immediately greeted by a pretty pissed off cultist holding a machete. He knocks us down the stairs, prompting a prolonged chase scene where Blake is pursued under the floorboards of a house, under a bed, and finally into a cave where he discovers a poor woman chained to a bed. We can all but infer what happens here, given what we've already established regarding Noth. After discovering a pit of more bodies sacrificed in the name of the Testament of the New Ezekiel, Blake begins yet another chase sequence through the town. Some of these chase sequences can be a bit of trial and error, as the correct direction is never super obvious, so it will rely on instincts at times, although generally speaking, just going straight is going to be a good rule of thumb 80% of the time. We elude our pursuers once more and find ourselves near Marta yet again. This begins a set piece that plays out with Blake having lots of room to run around and put distance between himself and Marta, but with the ultimate goal of having to push a slow-moving cart up against a fence that will allow us to proceed. This requires a bit of patience on our end, pushing the cart a bit, running from Marta, de-aggroing her, going again, and ultimately knowing when we have enough time to push it all the way without getting too greedy and subsequently caught lacking by Marta. We persevere and finally arrive at another chapel, this time empty save for one cultist who begs for Blake to kill him. Unable or unwilling to do so, Blake hides in a confessional booth as Noth and his apostles enter the room and begin to interrogate the poor guy, who is actually a defector of the cult. Noth coerces him using the girl we found chained to the bed as leverage in getting him to talk. We learn that Noth believes Lynn to be carrying the Antichrist and will give birth by morning, and demands that the man, named Josiah, tell him where Val and the heretics took her. As we mentioned earlier, Val wants the Antichrist to be born, while Noth would see the child eradicated. What follows is a pretty harrowing scene. Mary, the girl chained to the bed, is tortured in front of Josiah until he finally caves and informs Noth that Val has taken Lynn to the mines. Josiah and Mary are eventually put out of their misery, and Noth and company leave the chapel. Before all this plays out, I saw that I had the option to leave the confessional during this cutscene. So naturally, curiosity got the better of me, and I got a cutscene of Blake getting wrecked by these hooded apostle dudes. I did this for you guys, so you're welcome.
Alright, well, I guess that's what happens when you run out during that cutscene. I could have guessed that, but still wanted to see.
After everyone leaves, Blake emerges from his hiding place, now armed with the knowledge that he must venture to the mines if he is to have any hope of saving Lynn and surviving this ordeal. How Lynn could be pregnant and seemingly ready to give birth within hours is a mystery for now, but one that we will be able to shed more light on later. Blake journeys toward the mines and eludes some more cultists by entering what is known as Marta's Piece, out of the frying pan into the freezer. We learn that we can progress out of here by finding a hook that will open the way forward. Blake is forced to navigate a slaughterhouse, makes a quip about praying for refrigeration, eventually finds the hook, and just barely avoids Marta yet again. We go on to encounter a locked door with a large enough gap above the threshold for Blake to climb through, but upon doing so, we slip out of reality and into the school again. The thing about these transition scenes is that Blake will make progress in the real world as he advances through the hallucinations, eventually leading Blake to emerge from his dream state back into the harsh reality of the rural desert. This provides an interesting narrative thrust to the game, dropping the player into new environments without any memory of how we got there. With this in mind, we find ourselves back in the school and having to complete a game of Hangman on one of those old projector cart things from back in the day. We find the missing transparency, which illuminates the word unforgivable. After this, we hide in a locker, get jump scared, then find ourselves in the vents again, giving way to another cool transition where we learn that we were actually in a cave the whole time, apparently. The good news is that we are one step closer to the mines, having discovered an old wooden bridge that will bring us nearer to Lynn and the end of this nightmare. The bad news is that we get halfway across when a swarm of locusts appear and unbalance us, causing Blake to fall down. This is where we beat Nick and Laird for the first time. Laird is a deformed, dwarfish figure, and Nick is his buddy who he rides on. Anyway, they are the leaders of another faction called the Scald, a syphilis-infected group of outcast cultists. Nick and Laird believe Blake to be their messiah, going so far as to literally crucify Blake, thinking that by doing so, he will recreate the biblical crucifixion. They do this with the hope that it will lead to the Scald feeding on Blake's flesh and blood, which they believe will heal them of their sickness and thus allow them to re-enter the cult of Temple Gate. Blake eventually breaks loose of his wooden constraints, now cameraless, as Nick and Laird took it from him, believing it to be his modern-day form of gospel. Blake then weakly presses on, bandages his wounds, and eventually recovers his camera. Upon recovery of the camera, another flashback sequence is initiated, in probably one of the smoother transitions thus far. Blake remarks that he keeps coming back to the school earlier and earlier each time, with the implication that as we go along, we are gaining more context for what's happened here. During this section, there is a jump scare that reminded me of that one scene from Signs, followed by a chase sequence within the flashback where we're pursued by the tongue demon again. We follow Jessica through the school, hide in a locker, and transition back into reality, emerging from a dresser. We evade more Scald and dodge arrows from Nick and Laird as we advance on the mines in search of Lynn. Eventually, Nick and Laird capture Blake and throw him in a wooden coffin, now seeking to bury him alive. We manage to escape the coffin without that much effort, which, I have to be honest, this part of the game doesn't really amount to much. Blake just kind of breaks out and goes on his way. Coming so shortly after the crucifixion scene too, this part just came off as a minor inconvenience, and ultimately an attempt at just padding the runtime. That aside, we finally come to a hatch that will bring us closer to the mines, but in order to descend, we need to find a rope that will allow us to do so safely. We avoid more diseased cultists, eventually finding a hanging body that is using the exact length of rope that we need. Considering this fella doesn't appear to need it anymore, we take no issue with parting it from his person and dipping back to the hatch. Of course, now that we have what we need, we are heavily pursued on the way back by the Scald, as well as Nick and Laird and their flaming arrows. We make our descent, but it's quickly halted by Nick and Laird. However, luckily for us, apparently Nick and Laird are quite abusive to their fellow Scald, and it was at this point that they decided they'd had enough and push Nick, Laird, and Blake all down together. Blake survives the fall, but Nick and Laird are reduced to little more than a mass of limbs. Honestly, no great loss there, but it was honestly a little disappointing for them to go out this way. Compare this to the Traeger death from Outlast 1. Way more satisfying. Anyway, another transition follows shortly after. This time we are on the roof of the school in the wintry dead of night. We're forced to juke out the demon tongue monster until we experience another vision of Jessica. Back in the real world, Blake is getting closer to the mines. We stumble upon a large lake, as well as a vision of the sinister man from our school hallucinations, just kind of stepping into the water and disappearing. Blake makes a comment about definitely not going in that water, so naturally I decided to take a dip and see what all the fuss is about.
I gotta see what happens if I go in the water. Okay, that's what happens.
Remember guys, I do this for you. Anyway, after that little experiment, we embark on a raft excursion that is, in my opinion, the worst part of the game. Unless I was just doing something very wrong, I found the raft controls to be very sluggish and just downright unsatisfying to use. Before the actual raft section begins though, Blake spots a massive tower from across the lake, emitting the same sound we hear whenever the white blasts of light are taking place. Upon seeing this, one might assume that we will actually go to this tower at some point in the finale of the game. One would be wrong for assuming that. I actually forgot about this tower until it came time to start writing this script. It's easy to forget, in my opinion, since we see it once and then continue on our quest for Lynn. It doesn't really come up again unless the player is religiously reading the various documents throughout the game, which is very important in Outlast 2 if you want the whole picture of what is going on. I will do my best to convey and explain what this tower is doing here, how it relates to the overarching story of Outlast 2, as well as how it ties into Outlast 1. I'll talk about all that towards the end of the video, so for now, just bear with me. Anyway, back to this raft. It sucks. We paddle and paddle, eventually lose the raft, which I was grateful as hell for, but then we need to recover it, which was unfortunate for me, but good for Blake, I guess. Given the swarm of locusts earlier, I'm not shocked when we encounter a sea of dead fish, as well as a tidal wave that knocks us off the raft. There is some serious biblical shit going down, or so it appears. The tongue demon tries to drag us underwater, further indicating that Blake's deep-rooted trauma is starting to leak its way more and more into reality, blurring the lines between the two. Speaking of which, another flashback sequence begins, this time placing Blake in the pool of the school. If schools at night are creepy, and dark bodies of water are creepy, then a dark body of water in a school at night is approaching critical levels of creepiness. We run around the halls some more. You guys get the idea by now. I honestly was starting to get pretty tired of the school sections by this point, just because of how repetitive I was finding them to be. Narratively, as we will discuss, they are some of the more upsetting sections, but gameplay-wise, they could use some work. Anyway, after the sprinkler system kicks on and showers us with blood, Blake transitions back into the real world to witness literal raining blood, just in time, too, since we've finally reached the entrance to the mines. I'm honestly running out of ways to say that Blake transitions back to the school, so I'm just gonna say it. After being in the mine entrance for a bit, we end up in the computer lab, where we see Blake's AOL chat room name is Blake Against the Machine, which honestly kind of rules. Scares abound, more visions of Jessica hanging by her neck, etc., etc. At the mines, Blake runs into some heretics who are little more than crazed animals at this point. By now, the transitions to the school are getting very frequent, and we witness a disturbing scene of what appears to be dozens of Jessicas hanging from nothing in the snowy school courtyard. A haunting image, to be honest, and one that stuck with me from my first playthrough years ago. Blake is in the library now and is chased through a labyrinthine maze of bookshelves by the tongue demon, until we eventually make it out in one piece. We bounce back and forth between running from heretics and running from tongue demon guy for a while before we ever officially enter the mines. Eventually we do make it into an elevator that descends down into the depths of figurative hell after running from some more heretics. The elevator begins free-falling after a spell and we smash into the bottom, somehow without having our legs shoot through our skull in the process. Down in the mines we have to avoid heretics,
Oh, Jesus fuck.
solve minecart puzzles. They're pretty simple to figure out, and avoid cave-ins, all while doing our best not to soil ourselves. Eventually we come face to face with Val again in the heretic hideout deep underground. Blake, scared and approaching insanity at this point, does his best to put as much distance between himself and Val as possible. This penultimate set piece of Outlast 2 sees Blake having to pull two switches that will de-electrify a path forward that he needs to gain access to while avoiding Val in the pitch blackness.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ.
We give them the slip, use a minecart to bash our way forward, only for Val to catch up with us and give chase once more. We slide down a rocky outcrop and come face to face with a heretic who blows some sort of drug in our face. We start tripping balls and then walk into what I can only describe as a hills have eyes wide shut type situation.
What?
Your Father, the Christ we deserve.
Are they all banging? Yo, this is some ditties. I'm gonna get demonetized. Let me stop. I'm not even monetized yet, and I'm already worried about that. Bro, I have to cut this whole part out. This is crazy.
I am likely going to have to censor the shit out of this part. Unfortunately, Lynn is also here, bearing witness to this musty freak-off. Still suffering from the effects of the drug, Val mounts Blake, triggering another flashback sequence. This time we appear to have come close to the beginning of the flashbacks, chronologically speaking. Blake and Jess are in the pantry at school after hours messing around. This is where we finally start to get a better idea of what is going on with Jess after numerous implications that she took herself out of the equation, so to speak. The two of them are walking around the school, discussing things like kissing and Blake's relationship with Lynn, the sorts of things that kids talk about when they're approaching adolescence, topics that appear to make Blake uncomfortable. Jess clearly has a crush on Blake despite him seeming to be in the beginnings of his relationship with Lynn. Throughout these flashbacks, the player discovers through documents that Jessica comes from a troubled household. Her mother passed away from undisclosed reasons, and her father seems to strike fear in her heart. We get evidence of this when, as they are roaming the halls, they are caught by Father Loudermilch, their music teacher. He demands to know what they're doing here after school, and then dismisses Blake while telling Jessica to stay behind. He threatens to call her father, which she quickly begs him not to do. Loudermilk suspects there is something going on between them. Using his authority over these young students, Blake is told to leave Jessica behind and go home, despite her begging him not to. Obviously, as the player, we have alarm bells going off by this point. Blake begins to leave until he hears Jessica start to scream. He chases after them until finally finding Jessica's body in the stairwell with a broken neck. Loudermilk, likely frustrated with her resistance, threw her from the stairwell in an attempt to make her death look self-inflicted, and tells Blake to keep quiet about what really happened. It should be quite clear at this point that Loudermilk was using his position of authority to try and take advantage of Jessica. This is the most disturbing, upsetting stuff in the entire game. Blake and Jessica were just beginning to enter adolescence, and as a result, learning to figure out how to handle all the messiness that entails, which makes it all the more tragic. Furthermore, Blake, being just a young boy, was easily manipulated and didn't know how to speak up and do what was right, and instead stayed quiet about this incident, and it haunted him his entire life, finally culminating through the events of this game and forcing Blake to reckon with it all. Loudermilk was a predator, and he is more terrifying than Marta, Nick and Laird, Val, and Noth all put together. The tongue demon we've been seeing, that's a manifestation of Loudermilk in Blake's subconsciousness. They even have the same birthmark on their face. The entire series of flashback scenes have been teasing that Jessica committed the ultimate sin, but it was all really Loudermilk's doing. He laid a series of breadcrumbs after the fact to make it appear as though she had hung herself, when in reality it was him all along. The story here in Outlast 2, namely in these flashback sequences, is just honestly way more terrifying and disturbing than anything from the first game. Really all you had going on was like horror movie sort of torture things happening, but nothing of this, sort of depth going on where it's affecting children, and it's a tragic sort of situation where it's just playing in a different sandbox of horror. It's just more real and is touching on things that are disturbing on a primal level. Red Barrels is playing in an entirely different sandbox here, where the horrors go beyond just blood and gore and venture into deeply reprehensible, tragic reality. With the flashback scenes all but done for now, Blake comes to back in the mines and runs for his life. Chaos having erupted as Noth's followers have entered the mines and begun to kill the heretics, all while the mine itself begins to experience a cave-in. Apparently Val also died off-screen while we were unconscious, so hope you weren't expecting a satisfying death there. After making it out of the mine, Blake finds that Lynn has also managed to escape as well. Together, the two of them run from an approaching storm to find shelter, with Lynn incredibly appearing to be 9 months pregnant. The two of them attempt to rest and deliver this mysterious baby when Marta shows up and gives chase one final time.
Oh, shit! Come on! Come on!
Oh, fucking hell.
We elude her up until we cannot resist anymore. She looms over Blake to land the killing blow, when the storm causes a metal bar to smite her from on high, in a kill directly inspired by the Omen.
Yo, did she get struck by lightning? Oh, okay. That's even cooler. I thought she was about to get struck by lightning. That'd be sweet.
Was this divine intervention, or just a coincidence? I guess it depends on how much you believe in these kinds of things. Lightning strikes abound as Blake and Lynn frantically seek shelter, with Lynn being closer and closer to giving birth. The chapel comes into view and the two sprint towards it. Once inside, Lynn lays down and, in Blake's eyes, gives birth to a seemingly normal baby. Lynn, however, gives what would be her last words before passing away.
There's nothing there.
Blake is beside himself at this point, having lost Lynn to the madness of this nightmare, even after everything he went through. He passes out and we witness another flashback, this time even earlier in the timeline. Jessica and Blake discuss Lynn and her status as Blake's girlfriend. Blake then eventually awakens to Noth sitting before him. Noth, in a plot motif derived from Jim Jones and the Jonestown cult, has convinced all of his followers to take themselves out of the equation. He advises Blake to murder the child before slitting his own throat. It's worth noting here that Noth can seemingly see the child, same as Blake, despite Lynn not being able to. I'll do my best to explain what's going on with that momentarily. Blake leaves the chapel with the newborn baby and heads towards the sun, which appears to be pulsating and growing larger and larger. In what appears to be Blake's final moments, he witnesses the sun expanding to the point of engulfing him, the child, and the entire world in its wake. Outlast 2 ends with Blake and Jessica running through the school, hiding in the pantry, and praying. Jessica tells Blake that she will never let him go, and we cut to black. And with that, credits roll on Outlast 2, and I honestly feel like I need a warm hug and a shower. This game is pretty miserable, to put it mildly. And the way that it's crafted is done really brilliantly, in my opinion, because by the time you get the full picture of everything that's been going on, the game just ends right there, leaving you on a cold, bleak note, and the realization that all of the horrors of the game weren't happening in the rural desert of Arizona, but in those cold, empty halls of that school. Well, almost empty. So what the hell was actually going on here? How was Lynn pregnant? Why couldn't she see the baby? What was up with that big facility off in the distance that we never even went to? I will try to explain as much as I can here, but undoubtedly I will miss a detail or two in the process. At the end of the day, I'm not really here to provide an extremely detailed account of everything that happened before, after, and during Outlast 2, but rather I'm here to just kind of tell you enough to the point that it becomes easy for me to explain my feelings on those events and, how I felt about them and what they mean in the overall grand scheme of things, and just kind of provide my commentary. If you are looking for comprehensive videos on the history of Outlast, there are plenty of those out there. I personally recommend Gaming Harry's Outlast 2 retrospective lore videos. I'll try to link one for Outlast 2 in the description of this video. So let's start with that facility that was off in the distance earlier in the game. Remember when I said that it's very important to read all the documents in this game? Well, I didn't always do that, and as a result, by the time the credits rolled, I was very confused. I had a good feeling that Outlast 2 does in fact connect to Outlast 1, despite not being able to remember precisely how that happened. So yeah, I was very confused because there is a document in the game that I missed.
I thought this tied into the first game somehow. Guess it doesn't. I played this a long time ago. Probably right around when it came out, and I thought I just forgot how it tied into the first game. I guess it just doesn't.
For the record, on one hand, I do think that Outlast 2 does work on its own as a contained story, but by virtue of the fact that it is literally called Outlast 2, that in itself hints to a connection to the first game, and tying that connection to one very easy to miss document, probably not the way I would have gone, personally. In Outlast 1, there is a document we can find that talks about a Murkoff employee named Jenny Rowland, who, after growing more jaded by the work of Murkoff, decides to request a transfer to a different facility. What facility would that be, you might ask? It's this one. Yep, that was a Murkoff facility all along. That brings us to the white lights we've been seeing. Unfortunately, it was not God, but instead the workings of Murkoff, up to their old tricks again. It turns out that these were actually signals being projected by Murkoff as part of their research. Frequent exposure to these signals leads to hallucinations, which explains Blake's continued excursions deep into his own psyche, as well as the fanatical state of the residents of Temple Gate. Now, how was Lynn pregnant? Well, she wasn't. Not really. Calling back yet again to Outlast 1, we can point to a document there that explains that prolonged exposure to the morphogenic engine can produce a phenomenon known as phantom pregnancies in women. This includes protruding abdomen, nausea, stomach pains, etc., all without the presence of an actual child. Since the signals are operating on a similar wavelength as the morphogenic engine, it can be inferred that Lynn, who encountered these signals in the beginning of the game, in the helicopter, suffered enough of these side effects to suffer from the phantom pregnancy, but not enough to cause her psyche to break down, like Blake, since she was taken deep into the mines shortly after the crash, where the signals are likely much weaker, if not totally absent. So what this leaves us with is Lynn appearing to experience immaculate conception when it was really a byproduct of a science experiment gone wrong. Then we have Blake, more or less driven mad by this same experiment, so when the baby does arrive, he fully believes it to be there as a result of all the hallucinating he spent a large chunk of the game doing. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, basically, Outlast 2 is saying that no, there actually wasn't a god. There was no god there to save Jessica, there was no god there to save Lynn and Blake, and no god to justify the unforgivable actions of Noth, the heretics, the Scald, all these atrocities that they committed against one another. All these different factions committing these atrocities against each other, all in the name of a higher power who, for all we know, is not even really there. The only real higher power is Murkoff, completely removed from the events of the game, but with an entire holy war being waged below them by the people affected by their machinations, while they occupy themselves with experiments that bring new meaning to the word hubris. Although, there is an argument to be made that, wonders basically if there was a god here all along, working in silent but observable ways. Blake is saved several times throughout the game by various unexplainable means. Most notably when Marta is seemingly struck down at the 11th hour. By coincidence? It's very subtle, but it's there. The line between miracle and coincidence is practically non-existent, depending on who you ask. It's down to the individual and whether or not they believe. Faith can be a powerful thing in the right hands. Oftentimes, though, it just leads to tragedy. I should point out here that the comic series The Murkoff Account goes into the events that bridge the gap between Outlasts 1 and 2, as well as the things that transpired after Outlast 2 ends. For the sake of time, I didn't get into all of that and instead only scratched the surface, but for those curious, rest assured the rabbit hole goes much deeper than I was able to dig in this video alone. So, to bring it all home, Outlast 2 is an ambitious, yet flawed game. It builds on the gameplay established by the first game, but is entirely more ambitious narratively. The events of this game, in particular Blake and Jessica's tragic backstory, are truly upsetting stuff. When you get down to brass tacks, the real villains of this story are Loudermilch and Murkoff. Now, I'm not necessarily saying religion equals bad, and I'm not even 100% sure that's what Red Barrels is saying either. It's more so an indictment on people and the lengths that they will go to in order to shield themselves from repercussions for their actions, and the ways in which victims are affected for life by these selfish individuals. If Outlast 1 is like a found footage horror film, Outlast 2 is like a sort of psychological horror where the real monster the whole time was this manifestation of trauma. In terms of what I think the better game is, well, it's a hard question to answer. At the end of the day, I like both of these genres, but I have to be in the mood for them. Ultimately, I admire Outlast 2 for being different from the original in terms of going for scares that operate on a deeper level, and I think they make for great companion pieces to one another. With that being said, nothing in the moment-to-moment gameplay of Outlast 2 disturbed me the way that the game's final cutscene did. This one is gonna stick with me for a while. The final moment in particular left me pretty floored. I didn't remember this game being so depressing. Nothing in the original game left me feeling the way Outlast 2 did by the time the credits rolled. It's possible I'm forgetting something, but in all honesty, Outlast 2 is one of the more upsetting horror games that I've ever played. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that it revolves around, harm befalling kids, right? That's sort of a taboo subject in a lot of mainstream horror media, and it's not something you really see being touched on this overtly that often. The way this tragic backstory is woven through Outlast 2's main narrative is masterfully done, waiting until the last possible moment to just absolutely level you, leaving you feeling completely and utterly hopeless. It's hard to find a way to end this video on a more uplifting note, since Outlast 2 is not a game that ends on an uplifting note at all. So I guess to kind of sum it all up, I'll just say that I'm glad that this game exists. I think it's a good game, and I really don't think I'll ever play it again after this video. So now, at this point, I want to hear from you guys who have made it through the entire video. Tell me what you think of Outlast 2. Is it your favorite? Do you like the first game better? Do you prefer Outlast Trials? How do you feel about the idea that maybe there was a god here the whole time, watching over Blake, protecting him from Marta and, all the other pursuers? Let me know your take. I'm very curious to hear about it, because it's a game that, like I said at the top, it's divisive. I don't think that Outlast fans are completely united on this front. So I'm very curious to get some feedback from you guys regarding the contents of this game. Were you as deeply affected by the tragic backstory with Jessica as I was? I want to hear from you guys. So leave your comments down below. I will definitely read and reply to all of them. Lastly, I want to thank you guys so much for all the love that we got and continue to get on the first video on Outlast 1. Really glad that you guys seem to have dug that one. Leave me some recommendations on games to play next. I will definitely take all of them heavily into consideration. I do plan to do Outlast Trials, although I do think I kind of want to break from Outlast, so maybe I'll start another franchise and then circle back to that. I also might be streaming Outlast Trials on this channel, because I do know that it's a multiplayer game. At the time of recording, I've still never played it, so we might experience Outlast Trials that way too, through live streams. So yeah, everything's on the table right now for sure. So with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Keep gaming and stay scared.
Blue medallion.